Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fred Shapes. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's symposium from Nemaura Medical surrounding our new and innovative and novel non-invasive CGM called Sugar Beet. Sitting up front here, we have Dr. Faz Chowdhury, CEO of Nemaura Medical. We have Dr. Ian Cranston from Portsmouth Clinic in the UK. 6 years ago, in 2013, I was with a different company, one called Roche. And I went to a symposium here, and it was from Abbott. It was the first time that Libre was shown to the public. It was very interesting. We saw Jared Watkins there, who was the head of R&D at that time, now head of the business unit, present flash glucose monitoring. During that time and that talk, we also saw AGP, average glucose profile, presented for the first time. Many of us sat there and were actually scratching our heads thinking, what are we going to do with this product? Then took another 2 years, and in 2015 it was then launched in the UK and also in Germany. And it's been extremely successful in transforming the market from glucose test strips to sensors, to a sensor market. There are also other competitors out there that are successful, but nevertheless, the focus has been primarily, because of cost, on the type 1 patient. We'd like to show you this evening what we believe is cost-effective CGM for type 2 patients. Title of our talk this evening, or our symposium, is Non-Invasive CGM Diagnostic Monitoring Applications Across Different Patient Profiles. And this evening we'll have essentially the development history that Faz will then present. We will then take you through with some what is the product, and then Ian will take us clinical applications. One thing I can say is, I'll just put the mic down for a second. Is I, Dr. Chowdhury, the ladies over here, and Chris Avery out in the audience, we're wearing the product. The product is live. What we mean by live is it can be used. We also have the profile here on the smartphone, and all of us are carrying a smartphone that shows the value. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it is a live product. It is not vaporware, is what we want to get across this evening. Having said that, I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Chowdhury, who's going to take us through the development history.
Okay, well, thank you very much for attending, everyone. So, today I'll be talking about Sugar Beet, which is a product that we've developed at Nemaura Medical. And just to give you a brief background about Nemaura. So we are a US registered company on the stock market in the US, but we're based in the UK in terms of all of our operations. So here's a screenshot of a device that I've been wearing since roughly 10 a.m. before I took my flight yesterday morning. And as you can see, it's exactly what you'd expect for a non-diabetic. Except I have to say, when you look at the profile overnight, in fact, I still have the sensor. I'm still wearing the sensor, and it is still reasonably flat. But when you look at the profile overnight, it's not what I normally get. That's not your typical trend, because I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. So the stress of that gives me multiple spikes at night, I can assure you. Right. So in terms of development history, over the last roughly 7 years now, we've been developing this product. And earlier this year, a couple of months back, we received the CE approval for the product, and we'll go into further details with regards to the various claims that we've been allowed for the product. A few weeks back, we also submitted to the FDA under a de novo application. So I guess the question you've got to ask is, well, why did we embark on this development? Well, it's a known fact right now that continuous glucose monitoring is beyond doubt extremely beneficial to patients, because the ability to see your glucose profiles over the course of a day is far more beneficial than, for example, point-in-time measurements. But on the same note, if it is really that beneficial, then given that Dexcom have been around for close to 10 years now, thank you, and also given Abbott's presence on the market with the Libre for the last 4 years or so, why is it that adoption of CGM has been so low as a percentage of the total diabetic market? And so when we originally looked at this, we realized that, well, there are a number of issues as to why. You've got cost as being one of them, inconvenience another, etc. So our objective was to develop a continuous glucose monitor that would be highly flexible from a user perspective, but give you, if you like, the same level of accuracy, same level of data that existing CGMs provide. And of course, one of the fundamental issues that we face is that it is very difficult to encourage people and motivate them to actually continually adopt a device or a system like this. And that's where, as far as we were concerned, the ability to have something that allows flexible wear would actually potentially allow a far greater uptake and adoption of the technology. So that was really the background behind why we chose to get into this development, i.e. there was a huge unmet need out there in the market globally. So let's talk about the different approaches that we took from the outset. I think most people by now are familiar with interferesis, so I won't go into that in too much detail. There are organizations out there that have been working on skin blistering techniques, a pseudo microdialysis-based method, I guess. And ultimately, all of these techniques, what they were aiming to do was essentially move away from having a needle-based system that is required to insert a sensor or a filament into the skin to something where it could be minimally or non-invasive, whereby you have the system sat on top of the skin. And this is where all of these systems essentially come into play. When you look at optical systems, there have been a number of devices that have been developed by various companies over the last couple of decades using optical technologies. But of course, the problem there is there is a huge limit in terms of the physics that's involved and what the depth of penetration of light and the scattering and all the rest of it. And so that hasn't really got very far yet, although there are still companies working on that. And then there's measurement by inference, but I think if you're going to be measuring glucose, given the sheer number of factors that can affect glucose levels, measuring by inference is actually perhaps fundamentally flawed from the outset. And then you have microdialysis and microneedles. So I wanted to focus on microneedles for the simple reason that there are several developments in progress right now out there that use microneedles. And I just wanted to touch on this because it is really important to understand the pros and cons of such a system. So essentially a microneedle is a very small needle, and you have many of them. So you could have a few dozen, you could have several hundred, in fact, on a patch. And the idea would be that you would place the patch on the skin, and then every single needle would have to penetrate the skin to a certain depth. It would have to stay there for the duration of measurement without coming out. And you would have to have it within the depth that you intended at the outset, and therefore, unless you've got a mechanism to anchor it inside the skin, it's very difficult to keep it there. And if you anchor it inside the skin, how do you then get it out? Of course, there is another issue with microneedle technologies, and this is the issue. So I guess what you realize from this is that the bed of needles effect essentially means that if you've got more than a few microneedles, and let's say, I mean, based on the work that we've done, you are talking about potentially any more than 5, maybe 6 needles, then you are into a situation where the needles that penetrate the skin are entirely dictated by the area where you apply the pressure. And of course, if you are now trying to apply a device into the skin with multiple needles, whether it be to a depth of 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter, you're going to have a very complex applicator that ensures that happens. But even after that's happened, as I say, you go back to the issue where how do you ensure those needles stay in the skin? Because if the whole idea is that the sensor is the needle and you've coated the sensor with your enzymes and all the rest of it, then of course you've got to ask the question, well, what if those needles start popping out of the skin? The background of the company is in skin drug delivery, so we have a huge specialism in getting drugs into the skin. And I can assure you, trying to keep a transdermal patch on the skin just with its adhesive is difficult enough, let alone keeping needles inside the skin, especially when you're mobile, for periods of hours and potentially days. So there are significant issues with microneedles. In terms of how our technology works, obviously there's a limit as to how much I can say, but it's essentially when you look at a system like this, a diagnostic platform like this, you have three core aspects of the technology. You've got a method by which you either extract or you prepare the sample that you're going to measure. You've then got the method by which you're going to measure it, i.e. the sensor. And then you have the, you need a user interface. You need some way to take that data and present it to people in a way that's meaningful. So hence the user interface, the algorithm, etc. So in our case, we actively transport the glucose to the surface of the skin, and we measure the glucose entirely on the surface of the skin. And as you saw from my profile earlier, you can see that for a non-diabetic, you would expect a virtual flat line, and that's exactly what we get there, demonstrating that the extraction of the glucose is at a very controlled, steady rate, which is absolutely fundamental for a system like this to work. Once we've got it to the surface of the skin, we then use our own proprietary nano sensor technology to measure the glucose. And of course, when you consider that we are measuring extremely small amounts of glucose, compared to your micromolar concentrations, we are right down to picomolar, nanomolar concentrations. Therefore, the signal-to-noise ratio is extremely important, and all of this is, of course, built into the way the sensor has been developed. And then we have proprietary algorithms which allow us to convert those values into meaningful images or data that everybody can understand. So if I give you a brief background to the history, and I noticed the date on that when I took that photo from the album yesterday, 23rd of October 2014, yep. That was one of our earlier iterations, and I've been asked repeatedly, what are some of the most fundamental challenges that we faced during the development? And what I can tell you is if you look at that sensor is about 8 centimeters wide. That's a big sensor when you consider our current sensor is about 12 millimeters wide. And the single biggest challenge we faced was that no matter what you did in the lab, by virtue of the nature of our system, it was never representative of what happens in a human setting. And of course, we therefore needed a guinea pig, and I've trialed the device about 70 times now. So most of the optimization on the sensor was done on myself, for example. And so we've moved from a wrist-worn device that was as clunky as what you can see, where we actually hardwired the connectors into the sensor, to then moving on to something that looked a bit more like a small tape recorder on the left, and then we further progressed that to something that could be wrist-worn. But of course, as you do these developments and as you get feedback from users, one of the things that you realize is technology often moves on much faster than you would like it to, and nobody wanted something sticking out of a watch stuck to a sensor. And therefore, we had to move on from there to a system that could be entirely body-worn without bits dangling out. And of course, so our final iteration is this, which, as Fred pointed out a little earlier, most of my colleagues here are now wearing. And so in this case, what you have is a transmitter which is non-disposable. So the transmitter can be used for, say, up to a couple of years, or basically until the dog eats it, for example. And then you have the daily sensors. So our sensors are daily. So those electrodes, those sensors are replaced on a daily basis. And I think the way to look at it is those sensors are essentially slightly bigger versions of the finger strip test, except that they are ultra sensitive by manyfold. And that sits under the device and it adheres directly onto the skin. And in the case of, so the average warm-up is around 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then you're good to go essentially after you apply the device. With regards to intellectual property, we have multiple patents covering a whole host of aspects of the device, but also, as you will no doubt understand, we are on a continuous basis, we're still filing patents as we discover new things and novel things regarding our system and the way it works, especially now that we've put it out on the field. And I guess within the next probably couple of months or so, we will have another further 60 or so patents across a further half a dozen or so patent families. And that covers not just the sensor construct, but also the combination of the way we extract the glucose and measure it on the sensor, and also the algorithm. So there are a whole host of aspects of our system that are covered by patents. In terms of the pipeline, now that we have approval for the adult market, we are very aggressively moving towards doing the work that is necessary in order to get the product also approved for the pediatric market, but also for gestational use. And so there will be various studies that we will do to submit supplementary applications for that purpose. One of the great things about this platform is also that for other applications, there are essentially two elements of the current platform that we need to change. One being the chemistry on the sensor, and the other being the algorithm. And we've already done this for lactate, and in fact we published a report on that where we had some very promising and positive data with regards to lactate monitoring. And again, this is something that as soon as we have made headway with regards to commercialization of the glucose monitoring, we will be moving on to lactate monitoring in terms of commercial launch. Because with that, we will not require a CE approval as a medical device. We will, however, be conducting clinical programs for the purpose of lactate monitoring in intense ICU settings. And again, that's something that we're working on in parallel. But as far as the sensor goes, which is the most critical part, we already have developed a stable, optimized sensor for that purpose. So I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about was with regards to manufacture. So we have the approvals, we're ready to launch. Where are we with regards to our logistics and supply chain? Well, all of our components, the sensor, the electronics, the PCB, the casework, etc., everything is manufactured right here in the UK. Sorry, this isn't the UK, is it? This is Spain. So everything is manufactured in the UK. And even despite that, the cost of goods are highly competitive. And of course, in due course, maybe within a year, maybe 2 years, we will be looking to offshore that in other parts of the world, partly to supply other territories and partly for economies of cost as we scale up. And so the mobile app, we already have the Android version ready, and the iOS will be ready before we actually, within the next, I would say, few weeks. It is just undergoing verification. And as you're probably aware, those who know about the apps, unfortunately, you can't just take an Android system and adapt it for iOS. It all had to be developed again from scratch. And similarly with the device and charging station, they're actually manufactured, the electronics are all entirely manufactured in our hometown where we're based, in Loughborough in the UK. And all the disposables, again, are manufactured in the UK. The scale that we can manufacture at currently is sufficient for us to be able to do a launch into the key territories we initially plan to target. And those key territories are, of course, the UK, Ireland, and then you've got 4 or 5 major territories in Europe. And the thing to note is, with regards to launch plans, our objective is to prioritize according to the size and demand of the various markets. And that's the order in which we will be launching. And in fact, we have our UK and European partners here as well in the audience. Thank you.